June 19th, 1944. Altitude 6,400 meters. The air in the cockpit of the Japanese A6M50 fighter is heated to 40 degrees, despite the altitude. Ensign Saburo Fujita, a veteran of hundreds of hours of patrolling, adjusted his oxygen mask. His fingers in thin leather gloves rested habitually on the throttle quadrant. To his left and right, in perfect formation, were his wingmen. They were the elite of the Imperial Navy, or at least what was left of it. Another pair of slow wildcats, Fujita signaled over the radio, feeling the habitual excitement of a hunter boiling in his blood. Too heavy to fly, too slow to escape. Prepare to attack. Today, we will finish the job quickly. There was no fear in his voice, only arrogance, forged by years of easy victories. Fujita was used to the American F4F Wildcat being a target. Yes, it was tough, but it could not compete with the Zero in grace. The Japanese fighter was like a scalpel, sharp, light, and merciless. Fujita knew one sharp vertical turn, and the American would be in his sights, helplessly trying to catch the horizon. He did not know that at this moment, his life, as well as the entire fate of Japanese naval aviation, was divided into before and after. He did not know that those planes ahead were not Wildcats. They were Hellcats, and their pilots were not going to turn in dogfights. They were going to kill. What Fujita and hundreds of his comrades did not understand was that they had encountered the embodiment of the industrial fury of the United States. While Japan relied on the skill of suicide pilots and the fragile elegance of its machines, America placed its bet on the mathematics of destruction. This mathematics was simple and terrible. 2,000 horsepower from the Pratt and Whitney engine against 1,100 in the Zero. 400 pounds of steel armor against Zero. 650 caliber machine guns whose total rate of fire was 6,000 rounds per minute. This was enough to literally saw a Japanese fighter in half in less than 2 seconds of contact. The Zero was called the King of the Pacific. But on that day, over the Mariana Islands, the King Killer stepped onto the stage, and it asked for no mercy. In this video, we will not talk about heroism in a vacuum. We will deconstruct the cold mechanics of retribution. We will see how the Iron Works of Grumman turned a plane into an ideal industrial tool of destruction. We will walk across the decks of Spruance's aircraft carriers and look into the cockpits of those who survived the hell of the Philippine Sea. This is the story of how the laughter of Japanese pilots was replaced by screams of terror. The story of the Blue Ghost. The story of the F6F Hellcat. Welcome to the great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The battle that changed the rules of the game in the sky forever. To fully realize the scale of the tragedy that unfolded in 1944, we must return to the beginning. To those days when the word Zero was whispered like a death sentence. In 1941 and 1942, the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter was not just a plane. It was a myth. Created by the brilliant designer Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero was the answer to an impossible request from the Imperial Navy. A fighter with incredible range, capable of taking off from a carrier and outmaneuvering any land-based enemy aircraft. Horikoshi achieved this by applying a radical philosophy of maximum aggression. Every gram of weight counted. Engineers used a secret aluminum alloy called extra superduralumin. To lighten the structure, they gave up everything that protected the pilot. The Zero had no armored backrest. There were no self-sealing tanks. One lucky hit, and the plane turned into a fireball. But in the beginning of the war, this didn't matter, because no one could hit a Zero. Japanese pilots were world-class elite. They were taught for years. Each of them had hundreds of hours of combat flight time, even before Pearl Harbor. When they met the American F-2A Buffaloes and early Wildcats over Midway and the Philippines, it was not a battle. It was a slaughter. American planes were heavy, clumsy, and suffered from growing pains. The Wildcat weighed 1.5 tons more than the Zero, with the same engine power. Attempting to engage in maneuverable combat with a Japanese plane was equivalent to suicide. Saburo Sakai, the legendary Japanese ace, recalled, "The Americans fought like heroes, but their tactics were primitive. We just made a loop, went into their tail, and shot them down from a distance of 50 meters. We felt like gods of war." In Tokyo, they believed their superiority was the result of racial and spiritual superiority, that the Western man, spoiled by comfort, would never create a machine capable of defeating the Bushido spirit. Japanese propaganda mocked the Americans, calling their pilots mercenaries in iron boxes. But while the Japanese celebrated, the Americans learned, and the price of this learning was written in blood in the sky over Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander John Thoch developed a tactic known as the Thoch Weave. 2 Wildcats flew in a pair, covering each other's tails. If a Zero attacked one, the second would turn into its side. This was the first crack in the myth of invincibility. But the Thoch Weave was a defensive measure. America needed an offensive weapon, and that weapon began to take shape in June 1942, when in the Aleutian Islands, the Americans found a nearly whole Japanese Zero that had made an emergency landing in a swamp. The captured Akutan Zero became the key to the mystery. American engineers took it apart to the last screw. The results were shocking. The plane was so light that at speeds over 450 kilometers per hour, its ailerons literally jammed. It could not dive fast. It would simply start to fall apart. At the same time, at Leroy Grumman's plant, they were already working on a replacement for the Wildcat. The original project, XF6F1, was supposed to be just a slightly more powerful version of the old plane. But after the analysis of the trophy and consultations with combat pilots, Grumman made a strong decision. Forget everything. We are building a new machine from scratch. Leroy Grumman was an unusual leader. He did not sit in an office. He went out to the shop floor and talked to the mechanics. He invited pilots from combat units and asked them the same question. What are you missing to return home alive? The answer was always practically the same. We need speed to catch them and armor to withstand their hits. Thus was born the philosophy of the Grumman Iron Works. While the Japanese built their planes as fragile works of art, Grumman built them as tractors for killing. The foundation was the Pratt and Whitney R 2800 double wasp engine. This was the pinnacle of American engine building. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower at takeoff mode. To give you an idea of the scale, this engine could alone provide electricity for a small city block. It was so huge that the aircraft fuselage had to be widened. But the main emphasis was on survivability. Tanks were installed in the wings, which were covered with several layers of raw rubber. If a bullet hit, the rubber reacted with the gasoline, swelled, and instantly sealed the hole. The pilot sat in an armored capsule. In front of him was an armored glass 38 millimeters thick, capable of withstanding a direct hit from a 7.7 millimeter caliber bullet. The stakes were colossal. By 1943, the U.S. began mass commissioning Essex-class aircraft carriers. Each such ship required 90 aircraft. In just 2 years, the Grumman plant had to deliver thousands of machines to the front. Japan's industrial espionage was not sleeping. They knew about the Essexes. They knew about the new planes. But they made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the speed. In Tokyo, it was believed that it would take the Americans 3 to 4 years to master the production of such a complex machine. They hoped to finish the war before Grumman's iron monsters appeared in the sky. They were wrong by 2 years. By early 1943, Bethpage had turned into a mechanism working with the precision of a Swiss watch. Women, old people, yesterday's school children, they all stood at the machines. Under the slogan, "More planes, fewer deaths," they forged the weapon that was to turn the zero into a statistic. The Japanese were still laughing. They called the American pilots cowards who did not know how to fight in dogfights. They were waiting for a new meeting. They did not know that the Blue Ghost was already spreading its wings, and its first victim would be their own arrogance. In early 1943, the atmosphere at the plant in Bethpage was defined by one word: obsession. Leroy Grumman understood that he was building not just an aircraft, he was building an antidote. The XF6F1 prototype was originally intended as a deep modernization of the Wildcat. But when intelligence reported the real characteristics of the Zero, the project was scrapped. Grumman decided, we don't need a little better, we need crushingly better. The heart of the new machine was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. It was the fruit of 10 years of American ambition in the field of powerful radial engines. To give you an idea, when this engine was first started on the test stand, the vibration was so strong that the glass in the neighboring office building shattered, and the roar was heard for 3 miles. The design of the Hellcat was dictated by this engine. To direct such a flow of power, a huge 3-bladed propeller with a diameter of 4 meters was required. So that the propeller would not hit the deck of the carrier, the landing gear struts had to be made very tall. But tall struts are a risk when landing on a pitching deck. Grumman solved this by widening the landing gear track to an incredible 3 meters. The aircraft stood on the ground as if anchored, but the main innovation, which became legend, was the stow-wing wing system. Legend has it that Leroy Grumman personally tested the folding mechanism using ordinary paper clips. Huge wings with an area of 33 square meters folded back diagonally, fitting tightly to the sides. This allowed for an increase in the number of fighters on a single aircraft carrier by 1.5 times. Now, a group that previously carried 30 aircraft could carry 50. This was the mathematics of industrial dominance. While Japanese aircraft carriers were becoming empty, American decks were turning into solid steel fields. Inside the cockpit, the Hellcat was designed like a limousine compared to the austere Zero. The pilot's armored backrest was made of 20mm steel. The bulletproof glass of the canopy was 38mm thick. All instruments were illuminated with a soft red light, so as not to blind the pilot at night. Pilot Fred Schilling recalled, "When I first sat in the Hellcat, I felt like I was inside a tank that had wings. I was no longer afraid of Japanese rifle-caliber machine guns. I knew this machine would take any hit and bring me home. The cockpit was spacious. You could move in it without hitting the instruments with your elbows." Grumman introduced another detail: reliability. All vital systems were duplicated. If one hydraulic line was cut, the second one turned on. Electrical wiring was protected by steel sleeves. The aircraft was foolproof. It was difficult to stall into a spin, and it forgave the mistakes of young pilots. who had only 200 hours of flight time. Thus arose the brand Grumman Iron Works. This was a guarantee that America did not spare steel for the protection of its sons. And very soon, Japanese pilots would have to feel the hardness of this iron philosophy on their own skin. September 1943, raid on Marcus Island. It was a debut the whole fleet had been waiting for. On that day, the Japanese expected the usual wildcats. When their patrols saw the approaching formations, they reported, "Americans are coming. Groups of 12 aircraft. Look like old models. Prepare for easy victories." But when the Japanese interceptors tried to gain altitude, they discovered something impossible. The Americans were already there. Above them, Hellcats, thanks to their monstrous engine, gained altitude 30% faster than their predecessors. First contact occurred at an altitude of 5,000 meters. Japanese Lieutenant Toshio Kawai, in his Zero, moved into the tail of one of the Americans and pressed the trigger. He saw traces from his 20mm cannons and machine guns hitting the Hellcat's fuselage. In any other situation, a Wildcat would have already exploded or lost control. But this aircraft, it just kept flying. Kawai was terrified. He fired his entire ammunition load of cannons, but the American didn't even smoke. Instead, the Hellcat banked in a smooth arc, using its massive weight to gain speed. A second later, 6 12.7mm caliber machine guns literally sawed Kawai's Zero in half. On that day over Marcus Island, the Japanese lost 12 aircraft. The Americans only one, and that from anti-aircraft fire. News of the Blue Ghost spread through Japanese garrisons like wildfire. Surviving pilots reported, "They have a plane that is impossible to shoot down. Its bullets pierce our Zero through and through, like paper, while our shells bounce off it. They do not want to maneuver, they just kill us from a distance." This was the collapse of psychological superiority. Throughout October and November 1943, the raids on Kiribati and Rabaul confirmed the terrible truth. The era of Zero dominance was over. The Americans implemented a hit-and-run tactic. They did not circle in turns. They fell from above, like punishing hammers, shot down the Japanese, and escaped upward at a speed that the Zero could not develop even in a dive. The Japanese began to call the Hellcat the Blue Ghost. It appeared out of nowhere, dealt a deadly blow, and disappeared before anyone had time to react. But the Hellcat was not just a plane. It was part of a system that made victory inevitable. To understand why the Japanese were doomed, one must look at Task Force 58. This was the most powerful naval group in history. 17 aircraft carriers, 1,000 aircraft, and nearly 800 of them were Hellcats. This was industrial war in its purest form. The Americans weren't just winning battles, they were absorbing the space of the Pacific Ocean. The Hellcat became the standard working tool. Its unification was amazing. The engine, machine guns, radio stations, everything was interchangeable. For comparison, the Japanese had dozens of modifications of their Nakajima engines, parts from which often did not fit each other. While a Japanese mechanic on Truck Island tried to carve a necessary part from a piece of steel manually, the Americans simply threw away the damaged unit and put on a new one from a warehouse. Logistics was the silent killer of Japan. Behind every Hellcat in the air stood an army of 10,000 people in the rear. Texas oilmen, Pittsburgh steelworkers, railroad workers. Every 3 days, supply convoys brought thousands of tons of aviation fuel and millions of rounds of ammunition. By early 1944, the Hellcat dominated all operations. It became the eyes of the fleet thanks to the new radar GAM-1. Radars saw the enemy 100 miles away, and the controllers on the carriers directed groups of Hellcats directly into the tail of the Japanese before they even saw the American fleet. The Japanese command understood. The situation was critical. Admiral Somu Toyoda admitted that the Zero was obsolete, but Japan did not have the resources to replace it. They tried to create the Shidenkai, but they were produced in individual units, while Grumman produced one Hellcat per hour. The Japanese decided to go for a gambit, Plan Ago. They gathered all their remaining aircraft carriers and pilots for one decisive strike at the Mariana Islands. They believed that the Yamato spirit would defeat American steel. They did not understand that they were going to a meeting with a chainsaw. On the decks of the Essex and Lexington, pilots were already checking their sights. They knew the Japanese were coming, and they knew their iron birds were ready for a bloody harvest. Soon the sky over the Philippine Sea will turn into a cemetery, and the world will know a new name for this slaughter, a name that will enter history forever. June 19th, 1944, went down in history as the day when the fate of the Japanese Empire was finally decided in the sky over the Philippine Sea. Operation Ago, on which Tokyo pinned all its hopes, was to become a new Tsushima. But the Japanese did not take into account that in 40 years, the rules of war had changed beyond recognition. The era of radar, communications, and mass production had arrived. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, had a force that could not be overestimated. Task Force 58 was divided into 5 task groups. Each was a floating fist of carriers, battleships, and destroyers. But the main advantage of the Americans that morning was not guns, but eyes, electronic eyes. At 10 in the morning, American SK-1 type radars detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft at a distance of 150 miles. This was an advantage of 1.5 hours, an eternity in terms of air war. Spruance had time not only to launch all available Hellcats, but also to arrange them in several tiers at different altitudes. A ballet of death began on the decks. Mechanics in colored jerseys worked at the limit of human capacity. Planes took off every 15 seconds. Pilots, many of whom were yesterday's students, checked their oxygen, tightened their belts, and threw a last look at the deck of their floating home. They knew ahead was the most important fight of their lives. Japanese strategy under Admiral Ozawa was built on long arms. Their aircraft were lighter and could attack from a distance of 400 miles, while American ones could only attack from 250. The Japanese believed they could strike while remaining outside the reach of revenge. They planned for their pilots, after the attack, to land on the land airfields of Guam and Rota, refuel, and strike again. But Ozawa did not know that the Hellcats had already erased the concept of distance. The Americans implemented a GCI system, guiding fighters over the radio from the carrier deck. Officers in the CIC saw the battlefield like a chessboard and directed interception groups directly into the tail of the Japanese, using clouds as cover. At 10:36 in the morning, the first group of 34 Hellcats, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Blair, met the first wave of Japanese 70 miles from the fleet. The Japanese pilots were in shock. They expected to meet empty decks, but ran into a wall of steel. And these were not the Americans they had known in 1942. These were hunters who used their mass for lightning-fast attacks. Of the 70 Japanese aircraft in the first wave, only a few reached the American fleet. The rest were torn apart by Browning fire. It was like a fight of a professional boxer against a child, recalled one of the American gunners. We just saw them burst into flames one after another. Our radar showed how enemy dots disappeared from the screen by the dozens. By noon, the sky over the Philippine Sea had turned into a mosaic of black smoke and white contrails. It was at this moment that one of the fighter pilots from the aircraft carrier, Lexington, uttered a phrase that became legend and fixed this day in the annals of history. Looking at the Japanese aircraft, inexperienced, poorly controlled, in fragile machines, falling into the water by the dozens, gunner Enrique Rivas shouted into the microphone, "Hell, boys, this is like an old-fashioned turkey shoot. The great Marianas Turkey Shoot." This was not an exaggeration. Most of the Japanese pilots had only a few dozen hours of flight time. They did not know how to evade. They did not know how to work in a group. While the American Hellcat pilots had hundreds of hours of training behind them and the best survival system in the world. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu became the symbol of this day. His aircraft had a faulty engine. Oil splattered the windshield, and the propeller worked only at low RPM. But he refused to return. In one sortie, he shot down 6 Japanese Judy dive bombers in less than 8 minutes. He did not maneuver. He just fell on them from above, using the mass of the Hellcat. 50 years later, he recalled, "It wasn't a fair fight. It was a methodical elimination of a threat. My machine guns simply turned them into dust. I saw the faces of the Japanese pilots a second before the explosion. They were in terror. By 2 in the afternoon, the Japanese fleet had lost 385 aircraft. Think of that number. In 7 hours, Japanese carrier aviation ceased to exist as an organized military force. The Japanese F6F M50s, which were supposed to be the answer to the Hellcat, burned like matches. American incendiary bullets instantly ignited their unprotected tanks. This was called the Zippo effect. One precise shot, and a Japanese plane turned into a torch. Saburo Yamashita, one of the few surviving Japanese, later wrote, "The Americans were everywhere. Their planes seemed invulnerable. I saw my leader fire his entire belt into one Hellcat, but it just turned around and shot him down." We had no chance against this combination of armor and fire. During the entire day of the Great Hunt, the Americans lost only 23 aircraft in combat. The loss ratio was 19-1. This was a triumph of the Grumman Iron Works philosophy. When the sun began to set behind the horizon, Admiral Ozawa still could not fully comprehend the scale of what had happened. He had lost not just planes. He had lost the Empire's future. Together with the 300 machines that day, the last hope for preserving a qualified flight crew died. Those whom Japan had raised for years were ground to powder in a single day. In the evening of the same day, American submarines finished off what the Hellcats didn't have time to. No, it was the fighters that ensured freedom of action for the entire fleet. For Japan, the Turkey Shoot became a psychological breaking point. From that moment on, the Japanese command understood that they could not win in a fair fight. It was after the Marianas that the concept of kamikaze was born, the only thing left for them when Grumman steel closed the sky. The Hellcat proved to the whole world that industrial power is not only about the number of pieces coming off the assembly line. It is the survival of the human being. American pilots returned to their bases, processed their experience, and taught the newcomers. Japanese aces died in the first combat with Hellcats, taking their knowledge with them to the grave. By the end of 1944, the Zero had finally turned from hunter to prey. American pilots began to put dozens of marks on the Hellcat's fuselages. The record scores of aces grew by leaps and bounds. This was the industrial harvesting of victories. Industrial, like the Bethpage plant itself. Statistics are a cold thing, but in the case of the F6F, they sound like a sentence for any opposition. By the end of the war, the Hellcat had recorded more than 5,000 aerial victories, more than any other type of aircraft in the history of naval battles. David McCampbell, the greatest ace of the U.S. Navy, became the embodiment of the power of this machine. In one battle, he and his wingman intercepted a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell personally shot down 9 in one sortie, a world record for carrier aviation. He said, "I knew that if I did my part of the work, this machine would do its part. I trusted the Hellcat more than my own eyes." Japanese military leaders after the war admitted that the Hellcat was their main nightmare. Lieutenant General Kyoji Tomonaga said, "Your Hellcat destroyed our spirit before it destroyed our planes. We realized that against such equipment and such an organization, we were powerless. We fought a machine that did not know fatigue." The M4, Sherman on the ground, and the F6F Hellcat in the air became the two pillars of victory in 1945. These were tools created by democracy for the protection of its citizens. Not the most exquisite, not the most beautiful, but the most effective. Today, Hellcats are rare guests in the sky. Most of them were long ago melted into aluminum for peaceful purposes, pots, car parts, building cladding, or they stand in museums as monuments to an era when steel decided everything. In one of the U.S. Aviation museums stands a battered F6F. On its side are faded marks of 30 combat missions. A little boy approaches it and touches the cold metal of the wing with his hand, feeling the coarse rivets. He doesn't know about Saburo Fujita, Admiral Toyoda, or the Iron Works. To him, it's just a big blue plane from the past. But in this metal, the echo of that crazy day over the Philippine Sea still lives. The echo of engines working on afterburner and the clank of shell casings falling on the deck. The Hellcat was not the most aesthetic aircraft. It was coarse, massive, and functional. But it did the main thing. It brought home thousands of guys who otherwise would have forever remained in the depths of the ocean. And perhaps this is the highest evaluation for the engineers from Bethpage. They built not just death for the enemy, they built life for their own. The story of the Iron Works is over, but the lessons of that day over the Philippine Sea remain in our memory forever.